Hi, I'm Martin Rust. I'm with the Security and Policy Institute of Professional Development here at the University of Ottawa. My guest this afternoon is Philippe Lagassé. Phil is an associate professor here at the university in public and international affairs. We've been talking a little bit about geopolitical events and how they impact Canada and some of the implications for Canadian policymakers. And I want to turn our attention to the Ukraine and to Russia and some of the events that have been happening there. So let's start with what's your take on what is actually happening there?
Well, I think ultimately it's a division within Ukraine between two different groups that ultimately have very different visions of the future of the country. And necessarily one of those groups is allied with Russia, which has a vested interest in attempting to destabilize the pro-Western forces within that country. And now we, as Canada, have aligned ourselves very strongly with pro-Western forces, and that is, I would say, the nature of the situation we find ourselves in and they find themselves in.
We have a Prime Minister who's spoken out very vocally and very strongly in support of the Ukrainian people and their cause and their association with the Western movement. What else can we be doing in that area at the state level?
Well, it's a very difficult problem for us to resolve, simply because as long as pro-Russian groups are able to maintain a foothold in that country and maintain and effectively divide the country and prevent pro-Western forces and the government from taking back territory, we're at something of a stalemate. It's certainly not within Canada's interest to escalate the conflict, because that could potentially lead to military confrontation with Russia, which is not in our interest. Nonetheless, we do have to try and look for some kind of settlement, some kind of solution over the long term that would see Ukraine unified and hopefully have a pro-Western government.
Explain, if you can, the role of Russia in this equation. What is it, in fact, you think they're actually trying to accomplish?
My sense is that Russia is sticking to its traditional geostrategic position, namely, it wants to have a buffer between itself and Western Europe. It sees itself ultimately as a country that's perennially threatened, and therefore, to the extent possible, it wants to have something of a protective zone between itself and the United States and NATO. Russia has always made it very clear that it does not want NATO expanding, and when it saw a pro-Western government in Ukraine, it saw that potentially as leading down that road. It ultimately is not a country that sees itself, I would argue, as an existential friend of the West. It sees itself as a separate power, a separate interest in the region, and therefore it does not necessarily see its interests as aligning with NATO's and with ours. And that, I think, ultimately is the source of, dare we say, the naivete of NATO over the past decade, is potentially assuming that its interests and Russian interests would necessarily align over time, when in fact that wasn't the case.
No. So then it leads me to ask about Putin himself and whether his power, you believe, is on the rise or on the wane, or whether this is an attempt to sort of exert some muscle in the area.
Well, certainly when you look at Putin and you look at his long-term interests, finding Russia surrounded by adversaries is good for him domestically. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the impact that this conflict is going to have on the Russian economy, he, ironically enough, has an interest in keeping it going precisely because of the damage that it's done to the Russian economy and will continue to do. So we find ourselves in one of these situations where an elite in the country actually has an interest in maintaining a conflict that is ultimately hurting the country but benefits them internally.
Ukraine has long been the chessboard on which the East and West have played out a game, well, for a very, very long time. Where do you see this going?
Unfortunately, I don't see it going anywhere very soon. I see a stalemate ending up in place, and this being a conflict and a standoff that we're going to be living with for quite some time. And the larger issue for me is whether this leads to effectively a revamp of the Cold War confrontation between Russia and NATO, and what the larger consequences of that are going to be. But for Ukraine itself, I really don't see a way out in the short term. This will be likely a country divided between two armed factions that simply aren't in a position to come to an agreement.
To what extent does the last couple of years of an American presidency play into this? These are probably not the strongest years, the strongest time for President Obama. Is there a sense of political opportunism going on here as well, or does this have some different legs to it?
That's not my read of the situation currently. I think any U.S. president would be faced with the same kind of dilemma. There really is no easy answer for the United States or for NATO in this context. I believe there was some hope that pro-Western Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian government, would eventually be able to take back the ground that it's lost from pro-Russian forces. Unfortunately, in the absence of that, there's very little a U.S. president can do, or even NATO can do, without directly threatening Russia, which is a step that I think we all want to avoid.
Indeed. And hopefully the Ukrainian people can find a solution and a path forward. I'm Martin Rust with the Security and Policy Institute for Professional Development here at the University of Ottawa. My guest this afternoon is Philippe Lagassé, Associate Professor in Public and International Affairs here at the University of Ottawa. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you.